My name's Will Jardine. I'm your host for today as we're going to dive into the deep topic of Microsoft Cloud security and what that means in practice, specifically through the lens of some of our research and client engagements in the area. And we're going to specifically deal with the lofty question of secure by default, what that means in practice. And I've got two preeminent researchers and consultants here today to chat with me. Numero uno, Mr. Christian Filipov, principal consultant here at ReverseSec, worked here with me for a long time. Someone who's spoken multiple times at Forward CloudSec and other prominent cloud security conferences, purveyor of fine hand-rolled research in the area, and day-to-day helping our clients build, test, and all that good stuff, real cloud systems. And we've also got Mr. Christos Avram.
Thank you for having me.
The finest export from Cyprus, who, as well as doing a lot of cloud security research, specifically most recently around Entra and attack detection sort of stuff there, also is one of the leads of our on-premise network and infrastructure security offering. So has a lot of experience on both sides of the fence that we'll bring to the fore in the conversation today. So I guess to get started, let's take the big question, secure by default. What does that mean in practice? Is it just a slogan? Is everything actually hunky-dory out of the box, or is there still work to do? What does that mean to you?
So that's a very good question, Will.
Thank you.
And I think that a lot of organizations are frankly kind of asking that themselves. Obviously, kind of in the context of Microsoft and the way that I would interpret secure by default is that once you set up a service or a solution, then by default you should be in a good enough state that you shouldn't actively worry about kind of major misconfigurations or kind of an exploitative attack surface that would allow somebody to gain entry into your environment. And I think that Microsoft have done a lot of good things to kind of get a lot of the systems and solutions in that state, but I think that there's still a bit to go. Like, Christos, what's your thoughts on
Yeah,
it?
I agree as well. Security by default is that huge benefit that they gave to a lot of organizations, and it gave them a little bit of confidence, but it's not that fantasy solution that it just fixes everything. And yes, you stop worrying about certain stuff, but you still need to be cautious up to a certain degree for other parts.
So, I mean, if you look at that through your individual experience as someone who leads our offering on traditional on-premise network infrastructure, how does that look different? Like you said, it's kind of solves some certain things. What things do you not need to worry about now that you did before in on-premise world?
I would say, firstly, looking at on the on-prem side, it's definitely the landscape has been shifted. From the on-prem side, you definitely need to do everything yourself, worry about every single piece of layer, network layer, the protocol layer, every single bit of aspect when it comes to security. And definitely up to a certain point, Microsoft has eliminated that worry for various organizations. And it definitely got better. And you may call me optimistic here. I believe that Active Directory as we knew it will definitely change. I don't want to say here it's going to be extinct. It's not something that is going to be like when we talk about legacy, it's not something that is going to get obsolete, but it's definitely something that is changed. It's transforming to something else, and you have to see new perspectives. One example I would say, for example, how do you log into your infrastructure now? Microsoft offers various Azure VDI desktops, where basically you can log into your infrastructure from anywhere in the world, and then it offers various rules that enhance that security of those security solutions. So you want to add anything to that?
No, I think like from the perspective of kind of how systems are shifting, I think that you are right that we're probably not going to see the end of Active Directory, but it's definitely kind of changing the landscape in terms of how both kind of what sort of issues Microsoft are trying to fundamentally fix within the systems, but also obviously organizations kind of moving to more modern estates with like Entra as kind of the main cloud provider and identity provider within their estate, and kind of using that to protect their identity logins.
So I guess one thing that comes with that then, right? You've spoken there, I guess, of how the landscape of infrastructure has changed. The way attackers attack organizations therefore changes too, right? Could you guys maybe talk us through a little bit what you've seen in the last couple of years in terms of prominent attacks? Like, how are attackers evolving, how they attack, and therefore how do we need to evolve how we defend?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can definitely speak to some of the like statistics and kind of what we can see from like digital defense reports, for example, from Microsoft and other similar sources that discuss one, I'd say, big change is definitely from that like cloud identity-based attacks are on the rise. They're definitely a big focus from an attacker's perspective. Obviously, now that identity providers have consolidated into, let's say, Entra and a few big others like Okta, for example, like overall, the focus is very much shifted to how do we compromise these identities.
As opposed to compromising an endpoint in the more
Exactly.
world.
And then also another part to it that's more of a recent change is that obviously identity providers and these big cloud service providers see that this is a major focus area for attackers. So they put in a lot of security features like conditional access policies to try to enforce stringent and strict controls in terms of how users can log into this environment, which is good. That's exactly what we want. But that also has led to attackers kind of shifting their approach a bit over the last couple of years, where now they're focusing a lot on non-human identities as well within the cloud. So this is stuff like service principals, workloads, and also focusing on scripts and solutions used to build out the environment and that might have hard-coded credentials or ways to access part of the infrastructure that doesn't have the same protections that the human identity might have, such as, for example, mandatory MFA, or even having to use a physical key, security key to access these systems. I think that that's a big kind of difference to what we see attackers do.
Yeah, basically is what Chris said. The shift, we observe a huge shift on techniques, but on the same time, you see some sort of similarities. I would say phishing still has become the de facto rule that how they will get access to the infrastructure in the first place. So it's not all changing, but shifting.
Because the format of that phishing has changed, right?
Exactly, yes.
Could you give us an example?
So for one example, I would say device code phishing or using Evil Nginx. And don't get me wrong, attackers will still use the normal distribution of malware through emails and attach malware on the emails they send. But you see those new techniques of software I just described, like Evil Nginx or device code phishing, which are novel techniques that essentially steal the identity of the user, and they use that to move to the cloud environment, which is a new concept that we're seeing here.
Maybe one last question on like the kind of state of Microsoft security as we are at the minute then. Chris, could you talk to us a little bit around what's changed this year in terms of what new things have been introduced recently by Microsoft that have had an impact one way or another on the security of organizations using it?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I think one of the big ones that came over, well, it technically kind of started at the end of last year and finished.
I'll allow it.
And thank you. And finished around October is the mandatory MFA enforcement that Microsoft put in place for administrative activity and kind of create update operations against Azure APIs. For administrators and kind of administrative accounts. Like this was enforced. This was definitely a very good move, I would say, because now even in certain cases where you might have a gap in your conditional access policies, for example, in terms of how you enforce MFA, for your administrative users or users that have access to sensitive resources. Now this kind of mandatory MFA sits on top of it, where you would still have a level of MFA enforced when trying to kind of perform some of these actions, where previously you might have been able to just go with just a basic username and password combination. This is, I think, a very good example of like actual tangible steps that Microsoft are taking here, because over the years there have been like many reports that Microsoft have done in terms of how much adoption there has been of like conditional access policies, multi-factor for all users within an organization. And it was a bit slow. Like definitely, I think the few years of like remote working helped push this over the line. But obviously the additional kind of hindrance or kind of people feeling like it's a hindrance to have to do this multi-factor authentication did make it a bit slow. But now with these actions, there is a tangible effect to it, which is really good. There's also been stuff like the zero trust assessment, like framework and tool that Microsoft published pretty recently, like a month or so ago, which is effectively a collection of like PowerShell scripts and that would allow you to run against your tenant, and it would give you a nice infographic and results in terms of how you comply with guidance from industry bodies such as CISA, CIS, or overall from Microsoft's own guidance in terms of what they know and how they work with customers, tangibly providing kind of recommendations and what you can do to further improve your environment. So all in all, this kind of nicely links into what Microsoft kind of called the secure kind of future initiative that they've been kind of pushing for to try to make their product and solution better by default. As I said, there's still, I think, steps to be done, but overall, there's been definitely a positive change, I would say.
Okay, so I think that's a nice scene setter, where we are now, cloud security and Microsoft security in general. Now, what we're going to chat through next, I guess, is some of the specific offensive security research you guys have been doing, covering kind of two key aspects. We'll come on to first some of Christos's work against Entra and attack detection sort of techniques there, and how TTPs and the like are changing. And then Chris will come on to some of your SharePoint research later, and specifically that kind of awareness of how to use legitimate APIs, maybe slightly illegitimately, and that sort of stuff. So Christos, if we start with you, the work you've been doing in Entra, attack detection in Azure and Microsoft Cloud in general, what are your key thoughts to get started with?
So I would say, again, just a little bit of background on the research I made. It was focused on the last 5 years or so, where we see a bunch of threat actors being active specifically for Entra ID, like Midnight Blizzard, you have APT28, you have Lapsus, and much other actors originating from China, Russia, and some unknown outside that. And those, we've seen that primarily, again, as I said earlier, the primary focus is initial access. And again, that's via phishing. That hasn't changed much. It's just the techniques that have shifted.
As you said, device code phishing, evil
Exactly.
etc. Yeah.
And then once they have obtained that certain level of access, it depends. They will target basically service principals. That is the de facto like and their most favorable targets because on how privileged they are, and some other bits that Chris will describe later on how they can be made, that they can act in their environment without being as such detected, and they can remain under the radar when performing some certain level of activities.
So you mean kind of like telemetry logs there?
Exactly.
Or telemetry gaps, rather.
Exactly, like that. And once they have managed to compromise those service principals, we see heavy activity on targeting users' mailboxes. They want to exfiltrate data such as PII, find sensitive information in their emails, and then potentially move further into the network and obtain more lateral movement within the internal network. And one of the predominant ways of creating internal phishing techniques has been deemed as Microsoft Teams as their favorable target.
Okay. So I guess they're the evolving attack techniques. A lot of what your research and what's mentioned in the white paper talks about as well is how you detect those sorts of attacks. Because I guess it's similar to any sort of red team activity, right? You kind of need to assume it's going to happen eventually and have a good plan for how to detect and respond. Where has your focus been in terms of that detection engineering, purple teaming sort of activity? Where are the easy bits? Where are the hard bits?
I would say, firstly, before I move to the easy and what is hard, because that depends a lot, to be fair, I would say the key focus in protecting this type of attacks is definitely visibility. The heavy focus should be visibility. How do you target visibility? For every single organization, the first bit, it will be create a threat model and understand what is the attack surface in your organization. Yeah, this is more easier than said than done, but this is the first key point to understand what do you have and what is relevant to your organization. Once you have that, then you map basically the log sources to what do you have, and then you need to create custom and behavioral detection rules. Again, that's not an easy thing to say. We see many organizations struggle with developing these rules. And the reason is it takes too much effort. You can rely, of course, on, and you can use Microsoft's own built-in rules, which they have done an amazing job on helping these customers. And it goes back to what we were saying before, by providing some stuff by default and giving those weapons for the defenders to arm themselves. And this is a very good factor. But again, it needs manual effort from organizations to build those detection rules.
Okay, let me pause you there for 1 second. Christos has mentioned a couple of times there that these things are hugely variable. It depends on the organization, depends on the individual. Naturally, you guys listening in the audience, you're going to have questions of, what does this mean for me and myself? You're fortunate because we're also going to take some questions at the end. So if you have specific questions you want Christos and Chris to address, pop them in the chat and we'll get back to them later on. Christos, with that in mind, so you've mentioned there, I guess, some of the examples of, I guess, the softer things you can do first, like threat modeling, map out your inventory, that sort of stuff. I guess just, again, comparison to your on-premise experience, those are still kind of the same steps you would do in a traditional on-premise sort of attack detection case, right?
Yeah, it will be the same. Again, it doesn't change anything. It's just how you look at stuff. It still does require much effort in the cloud. It's not the main premise of the research I made and the recommendations that I provide is not the expectation that cloud will solve these solutions. It will still require, on its own, I mean, it will still require that manual effort.
So that's, I guess, what's the same. What's different? So what, if you're comparing how you do a purple team on-prem to in the cloud, what looks different in terms of whether it's how you execute your attack cases, the type of things you're looking for, whatever else?
On the offensive side, what it looks different, I would say not much. Again, I don't want to say that there's huge difference, but one thing that differentiates is perhaps as research is still novel in this area, and the attackers themselves are researchers. They take some time to research these techniques, develop new techniques, and in accordance to that, same as us, same as the defenders, it requires research to find solutions to these problems and emulate these attacks. So the main differentiator here is that on an emulation basis, it will just be much more slower than we used to do it on-prem, because the attack surface on the AD and on-prem, it has been here for ages. We have time to work on this, but on this is new. It's just something that's going to happen very slowly. Now, when we're talking about techniques per se, I would say this, again, I might be repeating myself here, is that focus heavily on the identity of the user. So it just uses what you have on-prem, because let's face it, again, many of our clients have still their on-prem infrastructure that is not gone and they just move solely to the cloud. Some organizations may do, but still many have hybrid environments. And we see attacks that target both of them or in combination, and let's see correlations between those two environments to hop from one place to the other.
From on-prem to the cloud.
Exactly.
Back again.
So that I would say is the main differentiator here.
Okay. You spoke a little bit about the identity of the user there. I guess what that brings in, and Chris, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on this, is one of the main challenges with detection in the cloud, right, is this so-called uncertainty of malicious intent. How do you differentiate what is an attacker doing something using a legitimate API from an admin doing something with a legitimate API? What are your thoughts on that?
So it's very much a problem that unfortunately we've not really been able to properly solve, I would say, as a community. Like, obviously, the whole point here kind of touches upon what Christos did, what Christos said, which is that organizations do really need to kind of sit down and actually do a bit of threat modeling on their estate, but also more importantly, I'd say, is actually define and actually describe how they operate from an administrative perspective and engineering perspective when operating or performing changes to their environment. The reason why I say this is that, like you alluded to, Will, is a lot of the activities that an attacker does against the cloud environment or cloud like service provider in general are fundamentally the same operations that the legitimate administrator can do, like
Could you give us an example there?
Well, I mean, even simple stuff like, let's say you want to access a file, and you don't have access to that file. If you have the right permissions, then you can assign yourself permissions to access a particular file and access it. That's exactly what you would do, or I would do, if, for example, I had access to a file in SharePoint and I needed to read it for a legitimate purpose. So how can we easily differentiate whether I have accessed a file that, let's say, you shared with me 2 months ago today, or was it somebody else that had access to my account or my active session that managed to access it around the same time? It's incredibly difficult if you just look at the logs. And so you really need to establish other context behind these activities to be able to pinpoint and figure out, maybe this is slightly suspicious, maybe this needs investigation. Let's say in the same example that I just gave, if I had done this, maybe just read the file an hour ago, maybe that could have been me doing some prep before we had a chat right now. But if maybe looking at the logs, I accessed multiple files in a row and then started downloading them en masse, perhaps that is a bit suspicious. Perhaps that might need a bit of a review to figure out, was that actually done by them? So, and you can extrapolate the same example to other stuff within Azure. For example, modifying conditional access policies. If I, as an administrator, need to make a change because there's been an issue spotted by a user or there's been issues accessing a certain application, then obviously there's a perfectly legitimate reason to modify conditional access policy. But then also an attacker might do that to allow themselves further access into the environment.
And I just want to add to that, to what Chris said. You often see this type of recommendations and see sarcastic solutions. You see them in various blog posts online. What has worked for organization A, what has worked for organization B by the community basically that they post out there. But that doesn't mean necessarily it will work A to B like exactly the same for your organization as well. You need to customize that based on what do you have in your environment. For example, I'm going to say an edge case here. If you don't use SharePoint, then maybe prevent it altogether or restrict it to as much as possible. Or I'm just trying to think on top of my head here. If you see certain devices that you don't use by your organization, for example, if you have Mac OS, restrict only to Mac OS devices. Again, it will be highly contextual on what do you use and what do you have in your organization.
On the point around detection as well, just before we move on to Chris's SharePoint stuff in a minute, one of the things you mentioned in the paper, Christos, is kind of detection gaps, for want of a better terms, where there's kind of missing log sources, or in some cases you might have to pay extra to access a given log source. What are your thoughts on that?
So this is what we touched a little bit in the beginning, is that Microsoft offers a lot of pre-built rules, pre-built solutions, but some of them come at a certain cost because it aligns with how much effort has Microsoft has put into this. And as an organization, requires to make some profit out of these certain solutions, which is understandable. But these are often too much categorized. They offer too many solutions, and often visibility is, as I said in my research as well, is like a Netflix, feels like a Netflix subscription essentially, because there's too much to see and what is relevant for your organization, and makes it much more difficult when you don't know what to look for or what serves your needs, basically.
Okay, thank you. Chris, you've recently put out some research specifically around SharePoint as well,
Yep.
and some kind of new attack techniques there, and I guess also musings on how you would go about detecting those. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about what that research was and why it's relevant to people?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll start from the beginning. Obviously, we had a lot of work to be done internally when kind of migrating, setting up the new business, and so I was
Yeah, because sorry to interrupt. That's an important bit of context here, I guess, as well. What you've done that not a lot of security researchers and attackers have done is you've just spent time building out our enterprise Office 365 setup internally, right? So very much in the builder's shoes, not in the breaker's shoes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been a lot of fun actually, for a change, not kind of explicitly breaking something, but instead kind of focusing a bit more on actually being helpful and building it. It's definitely also opened my eyes a bit in terms of certain issues that we do see, like organizations, whether large or small, that end up having. And I can definitely see a lot more clearly now how some of these issues or misconfigurations can arise from just like legitimate building of an environment and kind of functional requirements within a business. And so having the opportunity to actually look at some of these like defaults, kind of touching, I guess, on the secure by default bits as well, was interesting because SharePoint, obviously, it's been around for a while, but even like some of the defaults there, I would say, may not necessarily be the most secure by default. Just to give a very quick example that I think would have a very practical effect on a lot of organizations is, for example, permissions within SharePoint. SharePoint permissions, obviously, every time you want to share a file or create a sharing link, then typically it comes with a default permission once that link gets created and then sent out. And then respectively, once the user goes and clicks on that, then that gets applied to their user, et cetera, and they have. One very quick win in a certain degree was the fact that you can change, as an example, the default sharing link to provide view access instead of edit access to files. And even though it sounds like a very simple thing, the amount of like actual change it has resulted in terms of like files within SharePoint that are only readable and you can't just edit it or kind of modify it, was actually pretty interesting to kind of see a very tangible effect from something very simple. Like obviously it's not like the worst thing in the world. It's not going to lead to full-on compromise of your estate, but it's just like these small things that do add up. But anyway, that's kind of the beginning of the story. But functionally, as while doing this build-up, I really wanted to understand a bit more in depth how SharePoint works and how the underlying APIs work, because I figured, A, it would be useful from a building perspective, but also I figured, I'm ultimately a security consultant. I've worked in this a lot, and I just don't have as much familiarity in it. Let's use this as an opportunity to learn, and maybe we'll get something interesting out of it. And so as part of that, I ended up kind of, figuring out a bit more in detail how, web sessions with SharePoint and kind of the typical SharePoint experience that most users have, how that works, what sort of access tokens get used effectively to evaluate the session, figure out how you can enumerate, for example, SharePoint sites, SharePoint libraries that the user has access to without resorting to the equivalent kind of graph API commands. So instead, just using the SharePoint API directly itself. And then also using it to figure out, what's the typical activity that happens when you open a file, when you download a file, which ultimately resulted in actually a very interesting observation of a feature that seems to have existed in SharePoint for quite a while, but it might be one of those features that have existed for so long that people have generally kind of forgotten about it, because I genuinely struggle to find like topics online or forum posts that actually discuss it to figure out a legitimate, what is a legitimate use case for why an organization might want to have this enabled. And it is enabled by default, which was the interesting thing. So effectively, what SharePoint has is a concept of pre-authenticated URLs, or temporary auth is another way that they are referred to within the little documentation that was available for it. But I guess for people more familiar with kind of modern cloud environments and let's say AWS, it's more close to like a pre-signed URL. So effectively, it's a token that's available and attached to the URL that allows you to download the file. It's nothing particularly, groundbreaking, but the interesting thing that the research actually revealed is that this capability is enabled by default in the tenant, and every user that has read access to any single file has the ability to generate these tokens. So once you view a file, you automatically in the background generate a token, even though you actually don't use it by default when you access that file. Because typically, the way SharePoint works is that, like, let's say if I share a file with you and you now have read permissions to it, when you open it up, it does, or want to download it, it performs the download event without that pre-authenticated URL. It evaluates your session to first of all figure out if you are validly authenticated to SharePoint, and then it evaluates your permissions, and then finally provides you access with the file. In the background, this pre-authenticated URL that gets generated effectively, as the name suggests, allows you to download the file without doing any of those authentication steps, because it considers that at the time of that URL being generated, you have satisfied these conditions to be authenticated and have access to that file. So now anybody with that token can access that file for, I believe it was between 8 to 12 hours.
The implication here being, I guess, that would bypass conditional access policies.
Effectively, yeah, that's what I was gonna say, is that now that you have satisfied these conditions, if you as an attacker just use an existing, let's say, user session, let me take a step back, and let's take a scenario where you've got a hardened environment, you've got DOP controls on the endpoint. The endpoints are pretty, strictly controlled, and the expectation is that you should only be able to download them from within the corporate infrastructure. So either if you're connected to the corporate local network or you're on a dedicated VPN. And you can only download files to that endpoint. So let's say I've managed to get an implant on your device, and I've managed to have like a command and control server set up so I can communicate in and out of the environment. In a typical environment, if I want to grab the files from your device, then that might be, some network traffic that I'll have to deal with in one form or another that will go to my command and control server. And so this provides an opportunity for the defensive team to eventually spot, let's say multiple gigabytes of files being shared, to raise it and flag it as an alert. And that's exactly what we want. However, the problem with these pre-signed URLs is that what you can do as an attacker is that once you've got access as a user in their user session context, you can go through, enumerate multiple files, generate these URLs for each of these files, and effectively the only thing you need to exfiltrate is just 3 lines worth of a URL, which is nothing in terms of data. So effectively, instead of having to download multiple gigabytes of, let's say, zip archives or data that's available and you're interested in, you effectively just need to exfiltrate a few kilobytes at most worth of data. And then within a 12-hour session, within a 12-hour from when those URLs were generated, you just access them from whatever endpoint that you have, and it will just download the files, regardless of any conditional access policies, regardless of any network restrictions within SharePoint. It just allows you to straight up download it.
So putting an attacker's hat on then, it's quite a big change to data exfiltration expectations there, I suppose.
Effectively, because it neuters a lot of DOP controls that might exist on the endpoint itself, that your organization might expect there to be in place to prevent you from getting a file outside of the environment, or subvert expectations from defensive teams that they might be able to spot like frequent network communications to an unknown IP or kind of server that suddenly a user is communicating with, because this dramatically reduces the volume of data you need to exfiltrate to ultimately get access to those files in SharePoint.
Okay. One final plug. If you've not already, please send in some questions. We've had some sent in already, but we've got the guys here, so we've got a little bit of time to chat through. We'll come on to that in another 5 minutes or so. But if there's specific questions you have in mind for what this means in practice, for your environment, for specific SharePoint questions you've got, specific detection questions or Entra questions you've got, please fire them in. We'll put them to the guys and try and get you some specific thoughts. But okay, so that's, I guess, the meat and potatoes of the SharePoint aspect. Thinking, I guess, to Christos's point before, are there any high-level concerns from a detection perspective? Any detection gaps or really non-standard ways you have to go about detecting these sorts of attacks?
Yeah, so for the SharePoint issue, luckily enough, you can detect at least the file downloaded events, which is good. It obviously it can be a bit difficult to properly flag it unless you've got a more tight control in terms of what IPs, corporate IPs, traffic might be expected to come out of. You can still flag, obviously, an inordinate amount of file download events in a sequence. I think that's probably still your best bet in terms of like trying to detect on suspicious, like sudden download of a lot of events. But this is still a very challenging thing for an organization to detect, because first things first, you need to make sure that you actually have your unified audit logs configured, because this is an important point I do want to make, stress a bit, is that there are still organizations that do not have like the unified audit logs actually set up properly within their tenant, even if they might have the ability to do so. So, do make sure, if you do have a few minutes, that the unified audit logs are turned on, because
do it now, we'll wait.
Because it does help out a lot in terms of making sure that you have that visibility in these services.
Okay.
The other parts of the SharePoint research, I think, are not necessarily available in terms of, like, for example, the generation of these pre-signed URLs is a thing that happens when you visit or view an item. And that's something that's going to happen regardless if you just access an item, whether legitimately or illegitimately. So there is no way that you can actually figure out if, when a user has viewed an item, whether they've exfiltrated that pre-signed URL and are planning to use it in the next 12 hours or 8 hours, whichever the session length exactly was for those tokens. Ultimately making it very difficult, if you are particularly concerned about this, to spot. The one positive, I guess, that I do want to point out is that you can at least disable this feature altogether, which does make it hopefully an easy win for some organizations to disable this if they don't think that they will ever need this. But ultimately, I think it does prove the point that these systems are complex. Obviously, some of these systems are, I don't want to say legacy in a bad way, but obviously SharePoint has been around the block for a while. And the fact that there is a feature like this that exists that people just aren't necessarily aware of by default is both amazing and slightly worrying in a certain sense, that this just shows how much under the hood these APIs might have that organizations might just not be aware of until somebody goes and pokes at it.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to move on to the Q&A now. Just a quick, I guess, summary of what we've discussed so far beforehand, just to get the creative juices flowing. Secure by default doesn't necessarily mean that. Microsoft does a lot of stuff out of the box, but there's still a lot of work left to do, particularly for detection. And then we spoke about some key attack and defense scenarios in Entra and in SharePoint. If you want to read more about that, please go check out the white paper. Please go check out the talks from the guys and the content on our labs website. But now on to some of the questions we've got in. So I guess firstly then, what are some of the attacks we're seeing most often in the wild at the minute?
I would say, without question, is the phishing, and we're using Avalanche Nginx and device code authentication is a predominant one, I might say.
I think the device code authentication
Yeah.
definitely is a big one. Like I think Microsoft as well have made a point to kind of point it out in some of their threat intel reports recently of something that you should go look into and kind of controlling a bit more, like through a conditional access policy, which is possible to do. Other stuff that I think in terms of concrete attacks, like I said, I think targeting kind of service principals that are lying around is definitely something that has been increasing.
Which again, via conditional access policies is very important to make sure, again, it's a premium feature to apply conditional access policies to the
Workload
service
identities,
principals
yeah.
with cloud identities. But again, it's something that is worth looking to some organizations that are interested and have critical service principles at that for the matter.
The premium feature point is a good one, because the second question we got in is kind of around that, actually. We've spoken a few times about you have to pay extra for some of this sort of stuff. Some of this sounds quite expensive as well. I guess, Christos, first to yourself, what would be your high-level, quick recommendation that maybe a smaller organization that can't afford to do as much stuff focuses on versus larger enterprises?
So I get this question asked a lot, to be fair, and I would say it's prevention. The key thing, unfortunately, when it doesn't come to detection, when it's too costly, is focused mostly on prevention. And the main predominant fence that you need to configure and make sure it follows the principle of least privilege is your conditional access policies, is your A and omega. You need to make sure you apply you have only the restriction on the necessary devices that you use in organization. You apply controls such, although it's hard to apply, continuous access evaluation, which invalidate the token if it gets compromised from your device. And yeah, basically, I would say focus on prevention and make sure all of your conditional access policies are restricted as much as possible to what you use in your environment, and then see what you can do afterwards with how much effort you can spend on the detection aspect of it.
Okay. Final question. I'll come first to you, Chris, and then to you, Christos. Just quick answers only. This is a big question, but if you're comparing where we are now, where a lot of orgs are building stuff cloud native, so in the cloud first, how do you feel that compares overall to where we were 10 years ago when things were more on-prem? Do you feel we're overall more secure or less?
That is a very good question, because I think the overall
Thank you to whoever sent that in.
overall, I think the industry hasn't properly decided which way or the other, because you can argue both points. I personally do think that like the modern cloud environments are more secure than your average on-premises state like 10 years ago. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that a poorly secured cloud environment wouldn't be worse off than a more properly secured on-premise state.
So TLDR, it depends.
TLDR, I guess, yeah. It depends.
Christos?
I would say the exact same thing, basically. It doesn't change, as we said again over and over. It just shifts the types of attacks that are performed. And I would say right now there are even cases where a single mistake can give access to an attacker to your entire organization. Yes, it's more secure. Yes, it gives more confidence, but again, it's much more vulnerable right now since your infrastructure is exposed to the world.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I've learned a lot. That is unfortunately all we've got time for here today, but as always, we're ready, willing, and able to chat more. So if you have interest in hearing more about any of this, please get in touch. If you want to read more about it, please check out the white paper, hit up the guys on LinkedIn, etc. And thank you so much for your time and availability today. Thank you for joining us, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.